So we now have access to the beta for Sim Update 2 for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. And one thing that I'm super keen to find out is how the VRAM situation is progressing. It's no secret that VRAM usage in the original release and in Sim Update 1 that followed has not been great, so much so that I've been regularly running out of VRAM on my 16 gig 4080 Super, and only last week I upgraded / side graded to a 7900 XTX to get myself 24 gigabytes of VRAM. It's been a massive help in Sim Update 1, but is that going to remain the case in Sim Update 2? Well, I guess there's only one way to find out. Sadly though, we won't be able to test in the Phoenix Airbus A320 as Sim Update 2 does seem to be having some issues with that plane. So instead, I've devised a few new tests. So let's get into it. For today's testing, we're running with my 7900 XTX as I wanted to let the sim use as much VRAM as it wants. I noticed when I compared my 4080 Super to the 7900 XTX that in some situations the 4080 Super would use less VRAM, let's say 12 gigabytes, where in the same situation the 7900 XTX would use, say, 14.5. Due to it having a much higher capacity and not needing to compress things down, presumably. As for the rest of my system, I'm running my 5800 X3D with 64 gigs of DDR4 3600 CO18 memory. I'll roll my sim settings across the screen for you now, but the too long didn't watch is terrain level of detail of 125, object level of detail of 100, and a blend of high/ultra for the rest. Right, starting out at Bristol in the 737 MAX in Sim Update 1, and it's not a terrible start. FPS is in the mid-50s, and the sim is using a little under 13 gigs of VRAM, 12.7 to be precise. With my 4080 Super, this would be getting a little bit close to, for comfort really. Anything in the 13s or approaching 13 would oftentimes lead to issues eventually. Sometimes not immediately, but sooner or later, if you keep those levels of VRAM up, a change in camera view or maybe an airport being loaded in, if you're on final approach after a long flight, things can start to get a bit iffy. Again, keep in mind, this is a default jet at a default very, very plain airport, so this is kind of a best case scenario. Right, now let's swap into Sim Update 2. And oh my goodness, look at that. VRAM is now down into the 9 gigabyte range. That's almost 3 gigabytes saved. FPS has seen a nice increase too, but note how it suspiciously won't go above 60 FPS. Now, I'm on a 60 Hz non-variable refresh rate display, TV in fact, so I figured, I must have enabled VSync somewhere, but it wasn't enabled. It wasn't enabled in the sim. I've checked my AMD Adrenalin software. I've got no VSync enabled or anything like VSync enabled in that at all. So I don't know whether the sim is detecting my TV's refresh rate and imposing an FPS cap of its own. I don't know. I should also point out that there's no frame gen going on here. This is just raw performance from the CPU and GPU. No funny business going on at all. So pretty good result then, no? I'm sat here, honestly, beginning to wonder if my 7900 XTX was completely unnecessary. Maybe my 4080 Super can live on after all, and maybe I flip the AMD card on eBay. Who knows? Keep in mind, though, this is a default plane at the most default of airports. So let's stay at Bristol and let's introduce the iniBuilds A350, which is known for being a bit of a heavy hitter in terms of its detail and therefore performance, much like Phoenix and PMDG. So, at Bristol, in the iniBuilds A350 in Sim Update 1, we're gobbling up a whopping 13.7 gigs of VRAM. This is definitely problem territory for the 4080 Super, as generally the sim only gets allocated around 14 point something out of the 4080 Super's 16 gig of VRAM. So this would definitely be dangerously close to potentially causing a problem if it's kept up. Thankfully, though, not an issue on the 7900 XTX. FPS seems to be hovering around the 34, 35 FPS mark. So let's switch it into Sim Update 2. And look at that. I feel like I'm seeing things. We are getting on for 60 FPS here on the ground, and that is absolutely wild. Not quite 60, I'll grant you, and it fluctuates a bit, but consider where we were on Sim Update 1 with around 35 FPS. This is absolutely nuts with around 11.5 gigs of VRAM being used. That's over 2 gigabytes saved compared to Sim Update 1. Now, I had to go into the settings and just double check things here, as these results felt so far off. I wondered if I'd set the terrain level of detail to like 50 or something like that. Or maybe I had frame gen on and I didn't realize, but no, it all checks out. And during a takeoff roll, FPS maintained kind of high 40s, low 50s, which all things considered is pretty flipping awesome. This is a really promising start for Sim Update 2, and I'm starting to wonder if I perhaps jumped the gun on the 7900 XTX. Okay, let's raise the stakes slightly. We're going to stick with default airports, but this is a handcrafted default airport. It's JFK from Gaia. Starting out in the 737 MAX in Sim Update 1, we're getting just shy of 50 FPS, which isn't too bad. 13.7 gigs of VRAM in use. Again, that would be potential problem territory for the 4080 Super. Swapping into Sim Update 2, and we're seeing another nice jump in FPS, kind of like we saw in Bristol, flirting now with 60 FPS and 10.85 gigs of VRAM used. That's just shy of a 3 gigabyte saving. That's not to be sniffed at. Now, if we stick with JFK and jump into the A350 in Sim Update 1, we're seeing around 35 FPS, 13.8 gigs of VRAM used, and then if we switch it into Sim Update 2, we get a jump of 10 FPS, nearly 45 FPS now, and VRAM is sitting at around 12.4 gigs, so a drop of around 1.4 gigs of VRAM. That is very impressive indeed. Now, let's move to kind of the worst case scenario. Edinburgh V2 from Pirigi. Not worst case because it's bad scenery, quite the opposite. It's some of the finest you'll find in the sim, but it does take a toll on performance. So, starting out in the 737 MAX in Sim Update 1, we're getting around 38, 39 FPS on the runway with 13.9 gigs of VRAM used. This would be causing headaches for the 4080 Super. You really don't want to be pushing it that high. Keep in mind, for all of this testing, our terrain level of detail has been at 125 and our object LOD has been at 100. I could have just gone for the Ultra preset, and the numbers, VRAM numbers probably could have been a lot higher than this. We've actually been, quite restrained here. We've dialed things back quite a bit, so do keep that in mind as well. Anywho, into Sim Update 2, and while the FPS hasn't seen an increase similar to what we saw at Bristol and JFK, likely due to the Edinburgh scenery CPU limiting us, VRAM has dropped to 12.5 gig, so a very, very welcome 1.4 gig saving there. Now, let's introduce the A350. So we've got a heavy hitting plane at some of the heaviest hitting scenery in the sim. Starting out in Sim Update 1, and we are barely breaking the 30 FPS barrier due to a CPU limitation that's going on, and GPU VRAM sat nearly at 14.5 gigs. This would throw my 4080 Super into a tailspin. So let's see what Sim Update 2 can do for us. And once settled down, the VRAM has ended up at around 13.3 gig, which is a nice saving of around 1.2 gig, although that would still be a bit on the high side for my liking on the 4080 Super. Although FPS is very inconsistent. With my 7900 XTX, I get some coil whine with it. It's no big deal, as I use headphones anyway, I don't really hear it. But the reason I bring that up at all is because if I listen, I can hear the coil whine starting and then stopping and then starting and then stopping, almost like the GPU is being allowed to work, then it gets held up, then it starts again, then it gets held up again. So I think there's some kind of CPU weirdness going on here with a CPU limit. But this is a beta, so things like this are going to happen, and things like the Phoenix not working on day one with it are going to happen too. I think people often get the wrong idea about what a beta is, almost like they think it's just a chance to have early access to a finished product, and that's definitely not what it means. So, all things considered, we've seen some pretty impressive VRAM reductions with Sim Update 2, which could potentially make my 7900 XTX somewhat pointless. A video I'm working on next is using Sim Update 2 with my 4080 Super to see if we can trip it up due to a lack of VRAM, get it to do that thing it does where it kind of drops down to 7 FPS, which is a very strong indicator that you're out of VRAM. In an ideal world, I would also be using NVIDIA frame generation with Flight Sim 24 to top us up to 60 FPS, but I found in the past that using frame generation added even more pressure onto the already constrained VRAM situation, to the point where I just had to not use frame gen because it was causing me so many issues, which was a shame. So more investigation work to be done, I think, on the NVIDIA side next, and we can also check out DLSS 4 because that's been natively implemented now, I believe, with Sim Update 2. And with the 7900 XTX, we can check out FSR3 frame generation, as that's now been implemented by Asobo into Sim Update 2. So lots and lots to test, lots of content coming, so get subbed and ring the bell so you don't miss out on anything. If you're running Sim Update 2, do leave us a comment. Let us know what you're running it on in terms of hardware and how you're finding it. Share the knowledge, it always helps. And if you found today's video useful, leaving a like really helps a ton to both the channel and the video. So I will leave this one here. I hope it's been useful to you. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Take care of yourselves, be good to each other, and as always, happy flying.